Is Misha Patrick O'Leary, Clora Hora Ulscoil na HÉireann. Tá fearsum ag Ulscoil na HÉireann I gcultúr agus star an tír agus an cathair. Agus tá si go deasa bheith an búla le chéile arís, agus éisisteach leis an léit seo an ocht, agus beidir diaspóracht agus chomhrá bheith going níos déanaí. I'm Patrick O'Leary, Registrar of NUI. You're all very welcome. It's absolutely fabulous to have the rooms being used again and to have people in our building. In fact, the last couple of days has been a whirlwind of activity. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to NUI this evening. Dublin Festival of History is an important annual event and NUI is delighted to be part of it. Irish culture and history are important to NUI, so we are delighted to collaborate with Dublin City Council for what I think is the 5th year running this event, and we thank them for their support. It's really important for me, who's done nothing, to acknowledge all of the effort that has gone into this. I think particularly by Ruth Johnson, Dublin City archaeologist, and Dr. Emer Purcell from here in NUI. I'm sure they got a lot of support and help along the way, but I'm all equally sure that all of the heavy lifting fell to the two of them. So they have our thanks. Tonight's event is the middle of a sort of a history sandwich for us in NUI, and we're very happy to be part of it. Last week we had the unveiling of the plaque to commemorate the medieval church of St. Olaf in Fishamble Street, and tomorrow we'll have the 3rd workshop of the York Dublin Access Project, which will focus on outreach, heritage and public engagement. So I'm delighted that Dr. Edel Bhreathnach has agreed to share her wisdom with us on religion and beliefs in Viking Age Dublin, and I'll hand over to Ruth, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Pat. Well, on behalf of the partnership between NUI and Dublin City Council, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Edel Bhreathnach. Just a little background. Edel is a medieval historian with a particular interest in interdisciplinary studies that connect archaeology, history and literature. She was CEO of the Discovery Programme, the Centre for Archaeology and Innovation Ireland from 2013 to 2019, and she is a former visiting fellow to All Souls College in Oxford in 2016. Edel has worked on many large-scale projects relating to Tara, a rich landscape of prehistoric and medieval kingship in modern County Meath, and also on monasticism in Ireland from the 10th to the 13th century. She's published widely on these subjects, including her volume Ireland and the Medieval World, 400 to 1000 AD, Landscape, Kingship and Religion, which was published in 2014 by Four Courts Press. She's co-edited Monastic Europe, Communities, Landscape and Settlement, which is published by Brepulse in 2019. So without further ado, I'd like to just, maybe you'd all join me in welcoming Edel, our speaker for tonight's Festival of History International Viking Festival event.
Míle buchas leat Ruth as 8 na focail fial a hantais sin, agus buchas le cóirde cathrach Lachlia, go háire tú hain Ruth, agus le Ulscoil na HÉireann as an cura thuirtam an lécht a bheith thuirtan seo. Tróna go háire le Emer Purcell. Many thanks to Emer Purcell and Ruth Johnson for asking me to present this lecture this evening. Well, you may have thought that the inclusion of both beliefs and religion in this lecture's title was a typo. Far from it. I could have added customs, practices, rituals, rites. Such is the complexity of the subject of religion universally. Different disciplines approach beliefs and religions on the basis of their sources. Documents, objects, monuments, place names, folklore, etc., etc. And no one population or community living in a common landscape need necessarily practice the same religion and customs or hold the same beliefs. An official religion may exist that has been approved of by an elite, the obvious case being the Christianization of various parts of the Roman Empire at different times and in different circumstances. Normally due to the adoption of a new religion by, for example, emperors, their households, or other elites. But change at the top does not necessarily result in an overnight change throughout society, or that society dispenses with all existing beliefs or a belief system for the new one. Both can exist in tandem, often depending on how tolerant the new religious authorities are towards existing beliefs. The triumphalism of some early saints' lives, for example, depict their heroes attempting to transform a religious landscape by demolishing monuments and erasing natural features that were focal points of the heathen religion. This policy of transformation is classically described in the life of St. Martin of Tours, the 4th century saint of Gaul, written by Sulpicius Severus, who died around 425. Now, I quote a few essential paragraphs from this episode as it has a bearing on the subject of this evening's lecture. And here we have Martin. Again, when in a certain village he had demolished a very ancient temple and had set about cutting down a pine tree which stood close to the temple, the chief priest of that place and a crowd of other heathens began to oppose him. Martin carefully instructed them that there was nothing sacred in the trunk of a tree and urged them rather to honour God, whom he himself served. He added that there was a moral necessity why that tree should be cut down, because it had been dedicated to a demon. Then one of them, who was bolder than the others, says, "If you have any trust in thy God, whom you say you worship, we ourselves would cut down this tree, and be it your part to receive it when falling. For if, as you declare, your Lord is with you, you will escape all injury." And the usual happens. Martin, trusting in the Lord and waiting courageously, when now the falling pine had uttered its expiring crash, while it was now falling, while it was just rushing upon him, simply holding up his hand against it, he put in its way the sign of salvation, the sign of the cross. Then, indeed, after the manner of a spinning top, it swept around to the opposite side, to such a degree that it almost crushed the rustics, who had taken their places there in what was deemed a safe spot. Then, truly, a shout being raised to heaven, the heathens were amazed by the miracle, while the monks wept for joy, and the name of Christ was in common extolled by all. Now, this is highly dramatic stuff, but you find it all over the place in relation to Christian saints. Now, we should keep a few points in mind when reading this passage. First of all, of course, it's demonstrating the power of Christ. So it's coming from a particular background in Gaul, 4th, 5th century Gaul, and the great power that Christ has given his saint over the deities or the demons. We should also remember the writer and his audience, whether they're literate, non-literate, which in this case they would have been literate in Latin, whether they're a church congregation, so whether it forms part of a sermon, or whether it's for a community of monks who are extolling their great patron. The pine tree, of course, is the symbol of the enemy, the old religion. Sometimes a saint could triumph or succeed in converting a king and his household, only to find that the next generation of the dynasty favoured the old religion. Bede, the great English 8th century church historian, was particularly scathing about apostate Anglo-Saxon kings who abandoned Christianity and who, of course, were normally punished with violent deaths. Acculturation, which is a word that we find in a lot of scholarly articles these days, a process where one religion absorbs and makes its own of existing practices, is also common. It has long been argued that a hallmark of the conversion period in Ireland involved acculturation, the transfer of cults and cultic sites from deities to Christian saints, for example. To a certain extent, this is true, but was not unique, as sometimes is portrayed, as such acculturation happened elsewhere. And while there are no historical records of a violent reaction or forced conversion occurring in Ireland between the 5th and the 7th centuries, there are sufficient hints in early Irish saints' lives, especially the lives of Patrick, Bridget and Columba, that it was not without some brutality. And finally, we must also consider how various communities and groups in societies regarded and indeed needed religion. For example, the difference between how men and women respond to religion. And that brings in the whole question of fertility or a good household, or farmers, again, fertility, their animals, the weather, and priests of whatever religion who are involved in rituals and rites, prophecies of salvation or of the future, and of course, income. How is this overview of belief, religion, and conversion relevant to Scandinavian beliefs and religion as they were practiced in Ireland? This is a question we ask. It provides an outline framework for us to tease out a complex subject for which we have very few sources, historical, archaeological, or ethnographical, to give us a detailed picture. Our first step is to understand elements of the religion that the Scandinavians possibly brought here from their own lands. For a long time, the sources used to identify Scandinavian beliefs and religion were literary, especially the late medieval texts of Snorri Sturluson, for example, the Icelandic texts, texts that are mythical but pseudo-historical as well, the poetic Edda, and the descriptions of people like Saxo Grammaticus in the 13th century in his Gesta Danorum, all of which we must remember were written in a Christian and medieval milieu. Nevertheless, the details provided by these sources can be proven, or otherwise, against depictions and texts on, for example, wonderful runic stones, this one from Sweden, where you have both depictions and, in some cases, texts, from place name evidence and increasingly through archaeological evidence. Professor Stefan Brink has outlined the main aspects of Scandinavian religion, known as siðr, or fornsiðr, ancient custom. And these can be summarized from Professor Brink's work especially, as consisting of a pantheon of major gods, so your obvious ones, Thor and so on, and minor divinities, as well as spirits, giants, elves, and ancestors. It is an agrocentric religion, as is evident from place names, not unlike Ireland. There are regional differences throughout Scandinavia regarding the worship of certain gods. For example, the absence of cultic place names for Thor and Odin in Western Norway. The worship of ancestors was centred on burial mounds and burial grounds. Sacred spaces and objects were to be found in nature, in mountains, lakes, rivers, stones, trees, and so on, as well as in man-made structures, and even, like here again in Ireland, linked to a particular god. So there could be a territory that is named or associated with a particular god. But of course, like here in Ireland, prohibitions were laid down in the laws once Christianity took hold against building on or frequenting ancestral burial mound, cult sites of groves or stones. In his study of the archaeological aspects of continuity between existing ritual rites and the Christian church, which is a very hotly debated issue, as I found in Scandinavian churches, Anders Andrén has defined the landscape of Scandinavian religion as a multi-focused ritual landscape, corresponding to, quote, the multi-focused mythological world that is presented in the early medieval Icelandic texts about the Old Norse world. Scattered in the landscape, so there's a scattering as opposed to centralization. Ritual specialists, in other words, the priests of the religion, consisted of both men and women. And unlike Christianity, they did not belong to a hierarchical organization. There are some spectacular examples of continuity from existing cultic sites to church foundations in Scandinavia. None so spectacular as at Frösö in Jämtland in Sweden, where a church was built on a birch tree around which animal bones had been placed, with the altar, the Christian altar, placed right above the root of the birch. This phenomenon has been interpreted as, quote, a representation of the Old Norse world tree in the middle of the cosmos, and in the same way the high altar in the middle of the church was a representation of the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem at the centre of the Christian world. And the idea of the sacred tree is one that we have in Ireland as well, fairly strongly, and we have the amazing references in the annals in 975, for example, to the King of Tara, Moilachlin II, cutting down the wood known as Cael Tomir, or of Thor, near Dublin, so some sort of sacred grove linked or belonging to the Dublin settlement, while in 982 he goes off down to Maw Eyre in County Clare and he cuts down the sacred tree or the bille of the dynasty of Brian Boru, which is Maw Eyre being near Quinn, County Clare, being the inauguration site of the Dáil Gash. And even at the same time we have a reference to a fid nevid, to a sacred tree or a sacred wood in Armagh, in the middle of Armagh, and that being destroyed. So I'm trying to build up comparisons with what's coming from Scandinavia and what's here. Place name evidence offers an important reflection on Old Norse religion, and place names have been explored by many Scandinavian scholars in recent decades. In his study of what he calls theophoric place names, in other words, place names that includes a god's name, Stefan Brink highlighted the regional concentrations or absences of certain names. Brink's primary argument is that given the distribution of theophoric place names, Old Norse religion was not uniform and that regional differences predominated. So what happens when the Scandinavians come to Ireland and they settle here? When the Vikings landed in Ireland during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, they encountered a Christian society. Although a society that had retained customs, if not beliefs, associated with the old religion. It cannot be said that these customs were in conflict with Christianity. In general, they were maintained in specific circumstances. For example, royal inaugurations that we've seen with the blessed trees, in relation to healing, household and agrarian customs, many of them practiced by women. Early Irish literature retained echoes of the past, especially in relation to specific places, many of which were ultimately commemorated in the great corpus of place name lore, the Dín Hanachas. And some of the most striking are texts describing, for example, the mythology of the River Boyne and its source, the Sherish, near Carberry Hill in County Kildare, the cave of Cruachan, Rathcroghan in County Roscommon with its flying pigs that fly out of it, and the place name of the royal residence Loch Dághaur, or the Lake of the Two White Mares, which is Lagore, County Meath. Hence, these Scandinavian newcomers may not have found Irish society as alien as normally presumed, at least from a mythological perspective. We should also remember that many of the newcomers may not have been as ignorant of Christianity as assumed. Christian missionaries, Anglo-Saxons in particular, had attempted to convert kings in Scandinavia since the 8th century. And once the Vikings began to leave their homelands and to spread through the continent and westwards to Britain and Ireland, they immediately encountered Christian societies, and ones with distinct regional practices. we find very fleeting glimpses of how their beliefs may have been transferred to Ireland and how they used existing places as cultic or ritual sites, perhaps attracted them to them because of local traditions. So I begin with their burials, so Scandinavian burials in the Irish landscape. In their monumental work on Viking graves and grave goods in Ireland, Stephen Harrison, who is somewhere here, can't see Stephen, there he is, and my good partner, other half, Ryan Loughlin, offer a mine of information about the locations of cemeteries and single burials and the objects discovered in them. Interpretation of these burials and their contents opens up a significant field as to the transfer of Scandinavian beliefs and customs in Ireland, and equally importantly, how alien these practices would have been to the Irish. Viking burials and cemeteries in Ireland are predominantly coastal or located on navigable rivers and seem to follow a Scandinavian pattern of burial close to settlements. Another pattern was the siting of burials near boundaries, a practice that enshrined the extent of a settlement, a farmstead, or a wider territory. In Stephen Harrison's estimation, this pattern is evident insofar as Dublin was ringed by burial sites, and this will be to the horror of both the authors, to Stephen and to Reinald, but I did try to map it as much as I could. Stephen has pointed out that Dublin was ringed by burial sites to consolidate and reinforce the boundaries of the emerging settlement. And I quote him, "Given that a significant number of these Viking graves stand beside routeways, fords, or other access points, it would have been difficult to approach Dublin by land or sea without passing the site of a burial." So a lot of these, I should say, Cork Street, Donnybrook, are on routeways that we know already existed, ancient routeways. And then you have places like Dollymount on the coast. So they are sort of depending on an existing landscape. As I say, but this was an already settled landscape that afforded the new settlers appropriate locations to bury their dead, and many of them were very public sites. If any of these were in mounds, they would have been even more visible. This was a statement of appropriation and of the settlement being protected by the ancestors, presumably in many cases the founding generations of Dublin. We don't know how the original inhabitants of Dublin and its hinterland understood these Viking graves. So the ones who were already settled there, how did they react? If they had been present at the burial of a furnished grave, seeing military objects, jewellery, household goods, among other objects being buried with the dead, they would have been baffled, as the Irish, even before the coming of Christianity, did not furnish their graves to any great extent. However, the idea of burial on boundaries and of attachments to ancestral graves existed in Ireland at the time, and even as late as the 11th century. Dr. Elizabeth O'Brien, in her study of burial practices in Ireland, has demonstrated that the ferta, or the ancestral or familial graves, often marked a kingdom's boundary, and that in many cases burials of different ages were inserted into a monument, normally a mound. Or as we have here, hopefully, yes, at Holdenstown, County Kilkenny, a classic example of where you have here a late Iron Age burial, then followed by what seems to be Christian period burial, followed by the Christian church, or the establishment of a Christian cemetery, but one linked to the other. Battles were fought at ferta sites, and kings brought their armies to them in preparation for battle. Indeed, the most spectacular example is recorded in the Annals of Ulster in the year 1000, when Brian Borva brought his army to a place called Ferta Niva, or Ferta Nevad, the mound of the sacred grove or the sanctuary in Edel, which is in the South County Meath, North County Dublin area, where he was set upon firstly by the Dubliners and the Leinstermen, and then more importantly by his rival Muirlachlan MacDonald, King of Tara. The Annals remark that Brian retreated without battle or incursion by the Lord's insistence. While the Christian god may have been invoked, all parties would have known that Ferta Niva or Nevad, that place name, that this was a hallowed site, and probably one of the many access points into the royal domain of lands of Tara. Hence, placing graves, and especially mounds, on boundaries or at access points was a well-known phenomenon among the Irish themselves. As is evident elsewhere, Viking graves were located near prehistoric monuments and also just outside Christian churches and cemeteries. The reuse of prehistoric monuments in Ireland is rare. There is an example at Church Bay on Rathlin Island, where it's placed in the same area as a Bronze Age cemetery, which is marked by a standing stone. But Viking burials occur in or near churches and their adjacent cemeteries. A single male was buried in the upper levels of an indigenous cemetery at Donnybrook, which on the basis of its place name, Downach Broch, was probably the site of an early church. A furnished female grave was also discovered close to the boundary of the early monastery at Finglas in North City Dublin. Really. Now, the Finglas burial, probably dating to the second half of the 9th century, is particularly interesting. The woman was buried with a pair of oval brooches, this is the most complete of them, just beneath her shoulders, a comb, a small box or casket with decorated bone plaques. The complete brooch incorporates protruding animal ornaments, as you see them, lovely there, likely to represent bears. And in her study of the grave and its objects, Maeve Sikora suggests that the person who commissioned the brooches may have been affiliated to a bear cult or was a devotee of the god Odin. Bears and wolves are represented in Scandinavian lore as totemic animals. So her cultural background was probably Norwegian. But why was she buried close to a monastic site? Finglas was at the height of its importance during the 8th and 9th centuries, after which it fades from the annals. And it appears from a reference in an early monastic text that there may have been a house of devoted women, not necessarily nuns, but women who had vowesses, as we call them in medieval terms, attached to the monastic foundation. It is possible that this woman had been married into an Irish dynasty. The local dynasty of the Gallinga Bioga fluctuated their alliance between Irish kings and Vikings during the period, as they had to hold on to their land. In which case this woman would have drifted between her own cultural and religious origins and the Christian milieu in which she found herself in the vicinity of Finglas. The location of her grave immediately outside the monastic enclosure is not an indication of exclusion, but rather of acceptance, as many Irish Christians were similarly buried on the edge of the core church and monastic sites. For example, burials are found at Durrow, the great site of Durrow, just on the outskirts, the furthest out enclosure. So it wouldn't have been unusual in Ireland. And now we come to women in general and the expression of Scandinavian religion. The difficulty in interpreting grave goods as having religious or symbolic meanings is borne out by the contents of female furnished graves, which as well as jewellery usually contains household goods, especially implements used in the production of textiles, spindle whorls, wool combs, weaving batons or swords. Many such objects probably simply represent the woman's life and contribution to her family and community. Occasionally, however, grave goods appear to represent more than the mundane. Amulets or pendants that are common in the Scandinavian world don't really occur in female Viking graves in Ireland, except for example, this miniature weaver's sword found at Fishamble Street in Dublin. A further indication, for example, if we look at Old Norse literature, it alludes to wise women or prophetesses, seeresses, witches, vulva, the staff holder, who can foretell the future. They are similar to women who also appear in early Irish literature, for example, and the Táin opens with the prophetess holding a wand. Here is how the vulva, or the prophetess, is described in the Icelandic saga of Eric the Red. She was dressed so that she had a blue cloak over her, and stones were set in the border at the top. Around her neck she had glass beads, on her head a cap of black lambskin with a lining of white cat fur. She held a staff in her hand, and it had a knob on it. It was bound with brass and set with stones at the top around the knob. Around her she had a touchwood belt, and on it was a large leather pouch. In this she kept the magic remedies she needed for her sorcery. Although the saga is late, dated to the 13th century, it nevertheless seems to describe objects until recently classified as roasting spits found in female burials. And my apologies to both Stephen and Reinald for this distortion of their wonderful photograph. In his study of religion in late, as I say, one such object was discovered in the Kilmainham Island Bridge complex here. In his study of religion in the late Iron Age Scandinavia, Professor Neil Price reassessed these objects found throughout the Viking world as wands, which led Stephen Harrison in his description of this object to surmise that the Kilmainham object points to the presence of at least one high-status woman with perceived mystical powers at Dublin too, buried in the east or central zone of the Kilmainham Island Bridge Cemetery. But if you think of it, a community attempting to establish a thriving settlement in Dublin probably needed a prophetess or a wise woman to foretell their future, which, for a few decades was pretty fragile, or at least to recite prophecies to them. Meanwhile, outside their settlement, Irish poets, who were also viewed as prophets or seers, were holding wands and were doing the rounds in the countryside, proclaiming and prophecies and seeking favour in royal households and at major ecclesiastical settlements. They were Christians, but many of their poetic allusions and practices would have been familiar to the Dublin prophetess, except that they were presumably using different forms of very mysterious language that most of the population on either side would not have understood. Now, if we go to the use of the natural landscape, so caves and sacred trees and woods, well, we've alluded to the sacred trees and the woods earlier on. The text known as the Triads of Ireland names 3 dark places, Dorracha, of Ireland: the cave of Cnugva, which is the great megalithic tomb of Knowth, the cave of Sláinte, which is probably a mythical cave under Sliabh Donard, County Down, and Derk Farna, Dunmore Cave, County Kilkenny, a well-known system of huge underground system of caves. Of these 3 famous places, 2, Knowth and Dunmore, are recorded in the annals as having been visited or raided by the Scandinavians on a number of occasions. There were probably more visits than recorded, and not all of them, I think, for nefarious reasons. If we look at Derk Farna or Dunmore Cave, well, the archaeology of Dunmore Cave is very complex. Human remains have come from a number of locations in the cave system since the 18th century. A link has been made between the bones found there and the capture of Derk Farna by the Vikings of Dublin in 930 during their war with the Vikings of Limerick. And while there is a reference in a very late set of annals, the Annals of the Four Masters, to a massacre of 1,000 people in Derk Farna or Dunmore Cave during this episode, this is very unlikely, as it is very similar to the exaggerations that you find in the Annals of the Four Masters about massacres and numbers of deaths. And again, as Stephen Harrison has noted, the more recent archaeological examination of some of the bones of 18 adults and 25 juveniles from Dunmore show no evidence of trauma or violence consistent with a massacre. So apart from scattered human bones, 2 significant hoards were discovered in Dunmore Cave, one 9th century and one very wonderful 10th century hoard found in 1999 concealed in a rock crevice in one of the chambers. Silver fragments of silver, copper alloy ingots, Anglo-Saxon coins, wrapped up in a garment made of textile and leather fragments, and these wonderful conical shaped possible buttons or tassels. So we're talking about some form of knitted silver braid. Why was there such Viking activity in Dyrkfarna? And why did Geoffrey of Dublin capture it? Indeed, how do you capture a cave? During the 9th century, various Viking factions were active in this region, what is called the early kingdom of Osriga. And this was especially during the reign of Cearbhail mac Dúnchaile, king of Osriga, who died in 888. When at various stages, as always with the Vikings, they supported him, and at other times supported his enemies, the kings of Tara and Munster. So that may be a background to the 9th century horde. As to the 10th century, there was intense Viking activity in the kingdom of Osriga, which is around Kilkenny, sort of County Kilkenny, and a little beyond that. The kingdom of Osriga had become a focal point of the war between the Vikings of Dublin and of Limerick. The Limerick Vikings established a camp on Loch Bethruch, also in 930, a lake that has since disappeared, but that probably survives in the place name Knockmerrins, a townland on the outskirts of Kilkenny city. Hence, it is not surprising that some, if not all of these Vikings would have been attracted to such a spectacular system of caves as Dunmore. If we turn briefly back to their original homelands and literature, scholars, and most recently Knut Andreas Bergsvik, when he's looking at the archaeological evidence of caves in Western Norway, point to burial and ritual, as well as practical, for example, metalworking happening in the use of caves and rock shelters. But they're also associated with supernatural beings that could be sources of malevolence, wisdom, and power. For example, giants, thralls, and land spirits. So that's what's happening in the homelands. Caves could be places of extreme danger where young men might undergo ordeals as part of initiation rites from which they gained wisdom and power. So was Dunmore Cave regarded as such by some Vikings in Ireland, and were at least some of the objects discovered there deliberately deposited in the cave to placate malevolent beings? We might ask the question. If we turn to the Irish tradition about Dyrkfarna or Dunmore Cave, we may have an answer to the question. A Middle Irish poem, possibly dating to the 9th or 10th century, relates that the warrior queen Athfail, who is claimed to be the mother of Hercules, you do have exaggeration in all these poems, trampled the Lochtigern, the lord of the mice, at the entrance to Dyrkfarna. She also defeated the Dubh Lungus, the black band of exiles, presumably the Vikings, that had disabled the men of Ireland. We also know of a canine or a dog guardian to the other world, the Loch Dun, whose name is associated with a mound at Tara and also with a place called Tower na Horde, or Tara in the barony of Ard's Upper, County Down. So are the Lochtigern or the Loch Dun reflexes of the same guardian to the other world in Irish tradition? Do they know about this, the Vikings, and combine that with their own perception of caves? Did this draw them to Dyrkfarna for burial, for ritual deposits, and for concealment of goods? If so, or at least if it's a partial explanation, what can be said of their religious affiliations, especially by the mid-10th century in Ireland? They were straddling between two belief systems, with Christianity, as might be expected, becoming the more dominant as they integrated into Irish society, participating fully in local political intrigues to strengthen their economic and trading advantages, but on the other hand, retaining elements of their own religious origins. Not unlike, but a step closer to them than the Irish and their traditions. And now we finally come to Christianity as the whole question of the official conversion and religious acculturation. in them becoming Christians. The final part of my paper deals with the question of conversion to Christianity. Historical sources often associate the conversion of a people with one great dramatic event, normally the conversion of a leader, be it a king or a queen, or a military leader. In the case of the Scandinavians in Ireland, it is linked to the apparent baptism of the rulers of Dublin, who were also sporadically rulers of York, during the mid-10th century at the behest of the kings of the English, Athelstan and Edmund. But was conversion ever as straightforward as the official baptism of a king? And in the case of the events recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, baptism really were parts of a power struggle for the control of York. So it was a political baptism, if I can put it like that. Conversion happens at many levels. It is a slow process and can ebb and flow depending on political and societal circumstances. Now, this is a huge subject that has only begun to receive serious attention. And I think that the Irish situation can only be understood by comparing it in detail with the Christianization of other Scandinavian lands and communities. Hence, I will only look at two aspects, back to burial practices and back to the role of women in conversion. Are there changes in burial practice? Aligning particular burial practices with conversion to a new religion is no longer regarded as straightforward. In her detailed study of burial practices in early medieval Ireland, Elizabeth O'Brien has consistently stressed that Ireland's conversion to Christianity during the 5th and 6th centuries is not easily corroborated in the archaeological evidence. Ecclesiastical warnings such as those found in the 8th century Irish canons suggest that ancestral burial places, our friends the Fert we mentioned earlier on, were still revered if not in use. Even in the 12th century, Gilbert, the reforming Bishop of Limerick, was directing priests to ensure that burials took place in consecrated grounds, not only spurred on by the correct practice, as the church saw it at the time, but of course also by the potential income garnered from burial fees to the church. So that's what he was worried about as well. Whereas the tradition of burial in furnished graves was not followed in Ireland. So in other words, our source of dating is really carbon-14 dating of remains or charcoal or whatever. The Scandinavian furnished burial rite in Ireland was practiced by the generations who settled here for about a century between 830 and 930. We should also remember that these furnished graves represent only a fraction of the Scandinavian population settling here, presumably the elite. But it seems from archaeological evidence uncovered so far that from the mid-10th century the furnished burial rite had almost petered out. In Dublin, this is likely to indicate an increasing absorption into local society as the settlement became more stable and more powerful, and its rulers became more enmeshed in regional and national power struggles. Again, Stephen Harrison has raised a question about a grave discovered during the 19th century at Bride Street, probably dating to the 10th century, in which the sword was deliberately bent in one or two places prior to deposition. Also, probably an early Bronze Age halberd of Irish type was also bent and was probably deposited in the grave. A shield boss and spearhead may equally have been damaged, and Stephen Harrison speculated that this strongly suggests that this was a systematic process and part of a burial practice, a relatively obscure ritual consciously revived by those performing the funeral ceremony. Yet, this burial following a so-called pagan rite seems to have been situated in the vicinity of a church dedicated to St. Bridget, the leading saint of the area or of the province of Leinster. It might be viewed as a pagan reaction to conversion. It might be explained by the origins of the deceased. They may have come from Scandinavia or Scotland or the Isle of Man, or may have simply been a late adherence to an old rite, while at the same time hedging their bets regarding the nature of the next world. In other words, a mix of a Christian and a Viking cosmology. Now, with women, in recent decades, the role of women in converting a society, or indeed in retaining existing beliefs, has been recognised as particularly significant. A queen who converted to Christianity, or who was already a Christian and married into a dynasty, might not necessarily have converted her spouse and his generation or his parents' generation, but she could have influenced her offspring and their generation. To what extent did this influence root in a wider society depends on how receptive different levels in society might have been to change, and if the extended royal family supported a Christian queen's mission. The debate has been argued upon in the context of Bede's portrayal of Christian women marrying non-Christian Anglo-Saxon kings. Some scholars argue that these women were indeed influential, as were royal abbesses, while others arguing that Bede's interests were not historical in interest in women and how they Christianized society and their agency in doing so, but that this is all to do with the wider agenda he has in his history of glorifying and reinforcing the church in Anglo-Saxon England, and that debate continues. Irish dynastic genealogies, and particularly the text known as the Bán Hanachas, the lore of women, depict very complex royal networks in which noble and royal women were often used as pawns in ever-changing political alliances. Once the Vikings settled and began to play a part in these power struggles, Irish women, and probably Viking women, but the Irish sources don't mention them, were married off to Scandinavian or Irish rulers. The earliest reference is to the unnamed daughter of Edel Bhreathnach, king of Tara, who died in 879, who was the wife of Olafur, one of a number of Viking military leaders who are deeply involved in military campaigns during the 9th century, as Claire Downham has showed. Edel employed Olafur and his forces during the early 860s to face his rival Muirlachlan, the king of Tara. But of course, as ever, he turned on his Viking allies, presumably leading his daughter to be packed off back to her father, Edel, by Olafur. Olafur is also reputed to have been married to a daughter of Kinnaid, who, if she existed at all, was another Christian noblewoman, either the daughter of Kinnaid mac Alpin of Scotland, or Olafur's local ally, Kinnaid mac Cunning, king of Brege, which is now County Meath. So one wonders how much religion was the main consideration in these alliances, and if an individual like Olafur was really receptive to his wife's belief, or if it formed any part of the marriage alliance, and I think that was highly unlikely. But when we come to examine the dynastic alliances and marriages of the mid-10th century and later, we see how enmeshed the rulers of Dublin were in the complex familial structure of the main dynasties of Ireland. And my goodness, the British royal family and others are nothing like this crowd. This is a Hiberno-Norse dynasty fully engaged in Christianity in Ireland and Scotland. Ailill Cuaran died in Iona in 981 and may have taken the first steps towards establishing Dublin and its hinterland as part of a bishopric of the Irish Sea under the control of Iona. And you see him here, first of all married to a lady called Dunlith, who was the sister of the king of Tara, and then poor old Dunlith is packed off and he becomes the first husband of Gormla, who's the daughter of the king of Leinster, and Sitrick, the famous Sitrick of Dublin, is their son. And then she leaves him and goes and marries Brian Borova, and Brian Borova's son, Donogh, king of Munster, is of that union. And there is a story that she also marries Muirlachlan, which I'm not too sure that bad as she was, or active as she was, that she managed that. But anyway, you can see, how intermeshed they are. Sitrick, Aulif's son, changed direction regarding the basis of his kingdom's bishopric. He became part of a pan-Scandinavian strategy of establishing cathedrals, many with the dedication to Christ Church Holy Trinity, served by native bishops formed on the continent. Sitrick went to Rome in 1028 and on his return or at least before he was deposed in 1036, had Dunan, an Irishman who appears to have been formed as a Benedictine in Cologne, installed as Bishop of Dublin. The Scandinavian character of Sihtric's cathedral in Dublin is clear from the inclusion of a relic of St. Olaf in its foundation relics. Olaf Haraldsson was the King of Norway, killed in the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, who was informally canonised by his own bishop Grimkel in 1031, and whose cult spread rapidly in the Scandinavian world, including to Dublin, where a church dedicated to him was founded, and that's where we had the plaque unveiled a week ago. Further evidence that Sihtric and his family were Christians and in contact with the Irish church is implied by Sihtric's daughter's name. She is recorded as Cailleach Finéin, the devotee of St. Finian of Clonard, presumably, and again probably a vowess, suggesting, yes, that she was a nun or a vowess. She died the same year, or within a month of her father, in 1042. So did Sihtric's official conversion and building of a cathedral in Dublin change beliefs in the settlement's ordinary households? Personal beliefs are as complex as those of kings and bishops, and as with so many cultures, they can often be reflected in the tiniest of objects, such as amulets that offer protection or healing. The number of overtly non-Christian objects from Dublin is surprisingly small. For example, no Thor's hammer has been found in Dublin, although a matrix for one was discovered in High Street. A large number of personal Christian objects have appeared, including cross-shaped pendants of jet, one from High Street, one for Fishamble Street. One was found fairly recently during an excavation at Glendalough, and one from Newtown Low in County Westmeath. And then cross pendants made from amber were found in neighbouring house plots in Fishamble Street. One of these pendants, which is probably an imported object, according to Ryan Loughlin, may be deliberately ambiguous, and I think this is lovely, intended to reference the form of both cross and Thor's hammer. In this small sub-object, as with the Bride Street burial, we encounter what a recent scholar in Scandinavian studies has defined as dual religious belonging. The individual and local conflicts that arise in encounters between different worldviews. Here it's not a conflict, but a marrying together of two religions. And I think that this sums up the complexity of the story of Scandinavian religion or belief in Ireland, a story that needs a lot more work. So thank you very much, Gurmila Mahagav, for patiently listening to a highly speculative lecture. Thank you.
Hello everybody, I'm Emer Purcell here from the NUI. It falls to me to thank Edel for just a really wonderful paper. I think, as you said yourself, it's a very complex subject. To try and talk about Scandinavian belief is one thing, to talk about Irish belief is another, but to bring them together in the way that you have this evening and made it so enjoyable, and your illustrations and everything were really great, Edel. Thank you very much for that. We do have time for a few questions, and Ruth Johnson is here with a lovely roving mic. So if anyone would like to ask a question, if you just raise your hand and then wait till Ruth actually gets to you. Do we have? Oh, look. Oh, I spotted this one up the front first, so I'm sorry, Ruth, we'll go here.
You mentioned that gods in Scandinavia were kind of locally distributed. Now, obviously, the Vikings came from different parts of Scandinavia to Ireland. So is there any evidence to show that, say, the ones that came from a particular part to Ireland actually brought their gods?
No, that's the interesting thing. There's even from place names we don't have. I mean, we have Scandinavian place names in Ireland, but they're very much to do with coastal points and so on. And one of the I suppose there are two that I can think of. There's this Kyle Thomer, or the Wood of Thor, which is somewhere in the vicinity of Dublin. And then there's supposed to be Tullach Thomer, which is supposed to be somewhere near Tara. But no, we don't have that sense. And I mean, I hope archaeology, as we look at it more and more, may tell us more. But whereas in Scandinavia, like there are lots of them, so much so that you can identify regional patterns. Yeah.
Gentleman in the back over there, that's by the window. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always my belief that there was 4 sets of communities in the landscape of Ireland, and that being the pagan Gaels, the Christian Gaels, and then you have the Norwegians coming down with their pagan ways, and you have the Danish coming across with their pagan ways, and then they become Christianized, either set. And I believe the Danish were a bit more white than the black Norwegians. So you have 6 sets coming in to this landscape. But then you have this outsider, Sitrick, coming along and setting up a cathedral in the middle of Dublin where Kavanagh is the chief man. Unbeknownst to him, he lands in and builds a cathedral, and he's telling the Gaelic people, well, we're Christian, so this is it. And he's destroyed Kavanagh's ability to put a cathedral up in Dublin. And he must have gone berserk with him. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Norse word there, Edel, do you want to?
Yes, well, I suppose the Kavanagh you speak of, the Hinchley, they didn't really get their hands on Dublin until much later. And anyway, if I go back to my very complicated royal family system, where she is, they are. If you see here, Gormla, whose Sitrick's mother is actually of the dynasty of Leinster. So, you know, that's in the background to Sitrick as well. So I don't know that they would have been, well, we don't know. Would have been that angry.
Yeah, big complex melting pot there.
Yeah, huge.
Another question, maybe one more, yeah.
Thank you. Is there any trace of any Nordic folklore here in Ireland?
Well, the difficulty always with folklore is the time span between when things would have been recorded, which is obviously, you know, much later. But there is an element in the Irish tradition, and John Carey in Cork has written quite a bit about this, where the Favorig, who are the great kind of enemies of the Tuatha Dé Danann, he argues that there are many sort of characteristics that might have changed them into an understanding that they were the Vikings, so that there's a subtext going on there. And, you know, the great Cá Maithire, which is, you know, written and rewritten, that in the early period, that it's rewritten with this in mind. So, I mean, obviously, yes, Vikings turn up, but you don't know. The difficulty with folklore is what moves between the oral tradition and the literary tradition. And obviously there's the whole Brian Boru and Battle of Clontarf and so on. And interestingly, as Maeve Niordal has shown about the Battle of Clontarf, like that's rewritten as a saga right into the late medieval period. So, that's the complexity. Nothing I talk about is easy.
One more question from the back. Oh, 2 more, yeah. We'll go to the back first and then back up the front.
Thanks so much, Edel, for that. That was really, really fascinating. And I missed the very start, so if you address this at the start, I apologise. But it's just looking at sources from elsewhere in kind of Viking expansion, that there are some very detailed descriptions of religious practice. I'm thinking of, there's an Arab writer who describes in great detail funerary practices, including the ritual murder of a female slave and so on. I'm just wondering, could you analogously say, well, this probably happened in Ireland, that there's no reason to think that it wouldn't have? Is that even more speculation?
Well, I mean, I was reading those texts there recently, because Judith Jesh has them in her great work on women, and what struck me about them is classical. Geraldus Cambrensis said exactly the same about the Irish. You know, it was one way of how barbaric they were. I mean, there are elements, and you know, of burials and so on, which you know, you can see reflected in the burial practices. But I think so much of it is like, you know your barbarian description of the other, that it was very interesting to see that, and you know, things about how they were inaugurated and so on, which, oh my goodness, it was so reflective or similar to Geraldus. So
we'll have one more question up here.
Edel, can you give us an idea of the size of the population of Dublin mid-20th century and the relative proportions of Vikings and Irish?
For that one. I mean, that's a huge, that has been forever. People have been trying to estimate how many, what the population of Ireland was at that time. I mean, I've between 500,000 and 250,000, or is that too many? And I mean, there's of Dublin. I depend on my archaeologist
Howard
friends.
is in the audience,
Howard.
so we might
Siobhan Geraghty, in her excellent book on Plot 11, suggested that on the basis of the houses that she knew about then and the density of housing, that her estimate for the mid-11th century was 4,500.
Yeah, just
I mean, I'm just quoting her estimate, and I think that was reasonable.
Yeah.
But it's pure guesswork, really.
Yeah, it is.
Because we don't know the extent of the town, and so we don't know how many houses there were. We don't know the density of occupation of houses. There's so many things we don't know. But I think, insofar as one can guess at all, something like that makes sense. It fits into with the Doomsday evidence for English towns of the same period. Remember, Doomsday Book is 1086, giving figures for 1066 and 1086, and that it makes sense in terms of towns that would have been comparable in England with Dublin at that time.
I mean, what I would say is that, you know, they're, for that number, you know, small number, and especially the early period, they really do get a headline in the annals, you know, because I suppose they are the first big intrusion. So psychologically, I think it had an effect, certainly on the literate classes in Ireland, that these people came in. They were adventurers, and they may have the Irish may have been doing exactly the same and raiding monasteries and so on, but that they did it was particularly,
Great. Well, I think I'll draw this part of the evening to a close. If you'll join me in thanking Edel for a lovely lecture again. So just very briefly, a few words just to say thank you all for attending here today on behalf of ourselves and Dublin City Council. Also to thank those who are joining us through live stream. The benefit for those of you here in person is that we can go downstairs and have a glass of a refreshment of some sort and maybe a nibble. On the way out, you'll see there is a table down the back with some of our NUI publications. You are more than welcome to pick up a copy of anything that interests you down there as well. So thank you all very much.